What are some TV shows or YouTube channels that you remember watching while you were a little kid in elementary school?
Mickey Mouse Clubhouse.
Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, SpongeBob.
Roly Poly.
Spider-Man Homecoming.
All right. What about children's books? What are some of those that you remember?
Reading Rainbow.
I didn't read as a child.
No words between the
Sherlock
lions.
Holmes.
No words in the book.
Indiana Cover.
Between the lions.
Picture book.
Dogman.
Dogman. Yeah, Captain Underpants. All right. There are so many great things about children's shows and books, and one of them is the way they demonstrate and teach us important life lessons. And one of these lessons is how to interact with and get along with other people. From an early age, we are told to be a friend, to be kind to others, and to get along with everyone, even if they are different. As a teenager, you might look back and think some of those lessons are now a bit cheesy, but there's a significant reason why they get repeated so much in children's content. They're repeated because as we get older, our relationships are more complicated. When we were 4 or 5 years old, it's just as easy to make friends and get along with everyone, but I think we'd all agree it's not as easy when you're a teenager. And the Bible gives us wisdom about getting along with others, because getting along with others is always going to be challenging no matter how old we get. Now, after Jesus' death and resurrection, the Apostle Paul began planting churches throughout the world, or at least what was known of the world at the time. And while he traveled, he also wrote letters to new churches to help them learn how to follow Jesus best. Within 20 years or so, the church had spread further than almost anyone could have imagined. What started in Jerusalem, in what we now call the Middle East, had already spread as far as Rome, which was about 1,500 miles away by boat. And in order to encourage Rome, Paul wrote a letter that we know now as the book of Romans. And in chapter 12, he addressed an issue that faced the early Christians. Well, let's check out Romans chapter 12 and verse 18. It says, "Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone." Again, Paul is writing to a group of Christ followers, Christians, who are being persecuted for their faith. So my first reaction to reading this passage is to honestly think maybe Paul is talking about relationships inside the church, right? Considering that the things outside the church were so rough, I could easily see that this verse means that the Christians should be at peace with each other, because that way they might have a better chance of standing against their persecutors. But here's a little advice. Anytime you find yourself reading a single verse or a short passage like this, and you think you know what it means, do yourself a little favor and back up a few verses. Look for context. Where did this come from? That way, you can get a little bit more context and have a better chance of seeing whether the passage actually really means what you think it means. And so to better understand this passage, we're going to back up a few verses. That way we can see if we think it means what we think it means. So let's go back to verse 14. Verse 14 says, "Bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Be happy with those who are happy, and weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with each other. Don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people. And don't think you know it all. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone." So did you notice just how more difficult verse 18 became? If we only read verse 18 by itself, it sounds like Paul is saying that everyone in the church should just try to get along. But then when we read the context, we realize that Paul is talking about something much bigger and much more difficult. Paul is telling the church that they should not only get along with each other, but that they should do everything they can to be at peace with everyone, even their enemies, even the people who are persecuting them. And beyond that, he's telling them to actually pray that God will bless those who are persecuting them. Praying for your enemies. Sounds easy, right? But I'm genuinely curious to know what it must have been like for the Roman church to read this letter for the first time. There's some debate over what year Paul wrote the letter, but most scholars believe that Paul wrote this between 55 and 57 AD, which means that the Roman church would have read it within the first few years of Emperor Nero's rule. And during Nero's rule, the persecution of Christians became increasingly violent. And initially it started because of two reasons. And the first were Christians were seen as problematic because they refused to worship the pantheon of gods and goddesses that the Romans worshipped. To be clear, it wasn't necessarily illegal in first century Rome, but in many ways it was seen as subversive and countercultural. The second reason Christians were a target of growing persecution in Rome was traditionally the Roman emperor was considered worthy of worship. Kind of like the Egyptians worshiped Pharaoh as a god, the Romans kind of did this with their emperors. But Nero even took this a step further by associating himself with the Roman sun god Sol. Plain and simple, Nero didn't like the idea that anyone would worship anyone else but him. And since the Christians worshiped Jesus, they became one of the prime targets of Nero's rage. And when it came to the Christians, Emperor Nero was brutal. I'm sure it might have started out small, but within a few years, after Paul wrote his letter to the Romans, Nero took things to a level that no one was expecting. In the year 64, a massive fire engulfed the city of Rome. And even though most historians agree that the fire was most likely set by Nero himself, he blamed it on the Christians who lived in the city. Nero then used the fire as a reason to begin persecuting Christians on a scale that no one could have imagined. This is the short version, but basically Nero would have Christians arrested, dipped in oil, crucified, and then set on fire. And Nero was also the guy who started the practice of having Christians fight as gladiators in the Roman Colosseum. And although Nero's persecution of Christians wouldn't hit its peak for a few more years, at that point, Paul is writing this letter. Life had already become difficult for this group of early believers. Let's just say that the citizens of first century Rome didn't have Bluey to watch when they were growing up, and it showed. So now we have a little bit more context of what is brewing in Rome. So let's look again at Romans 12:18. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Knowing what was happening in Rome at that time makes this challenge seem impossible, doesn't it? I can almost hear the Roman church responding with a collective say, "What?" Or, "You want us to do what now?" In the end, it's likely that many of the Christians who first read Paul's letter died as a result of the persecution they faced. It's also very likely that Paul himself would ultimately face trial and execution in Rome only a few years after the Great Fire. So this letter, Romans, was written almost 2,000 years ago, thousands of miles away, in a culture drastically different from ours. But one of my favorite things about Scripture is that there is so much that we can learn if we are willing to dig in. So here is the first idea that I noticed, that even when it seems like peace is impossible, peace is still the goal. Peace is still the goal. It would be really easy to compare our daily lives with the daily lives of Roman Christians and think, there's no way that this was meant to apply to us. But I think we'd be a little too hasty if we jump to that conclusion, because the idea of seeking peace is found in Scripture. For example, here's what King Solomon said in the book of Proverbs almost 1,000 years before Paul wrote Romans. Proverbs 16:7 says, when people's lives please the Lord, even their enemies are at peace with them. And this is what Jesus said in Matthew about 20 years before Paul wrote Romans. Matthew 5:9 says, God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called the children of God. But the more you read Scripture, the more you'll start to realize that peace is a part of God's character. It's a crucial part of who He is. And when Scripture calls us to make peace the goal, we get the opportunity to join God in what He's already doing in our world. But that can't happen if we place a higher value on getting even with others when we've been wrong. That's called revenge. We're supposed to be at peace. Something else that I want to make sure you don't miss is that even though lasting peace requires everyone to be involved on the same page, number two, peace starts with one person. Peace starts with one person. You can't choose how people treat you, but you can choose how you respond to those people. And in situations where you are treated poorly, if you respond with retaliation, you are all but guaranteed to move further and further away from peace. That's why Paul also said this in Romans chapter 12, never pay back evil with more evil. Now, at first, it might seem like Paul is saying that the victim is the one responsible for peacefully resolving conflict, but I don't think that quite captures the full idea that Paul is sharing here. Instead, I think Paul is pointing out that when we're in the middle of conflict, when we generally have one of two choices, we can make things worse or we can make things better. He's saying that if we have a choice, we should always make things better. We should always make things better. Choose to make things better. No, we can't make the choice for the other person, but at some point, if conflict is going to be resolved, it has to start with someone. And if peace is the goal, then it doesn't make sense for us to wait for someone else to make that choice. That's why Paul also included the first 6 words of verse 18. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Right, he very easily could have just said, live in peace with everyone, but he didn't. He said, do all that you can to live in peace. And that's a big difference because it acknowledges the idea that peace doesn't just happen because one person wants it. It's a process that involves everyone who is involved in conflict. But it's a process that starts when one person is willing to take the first step. And since peace is the goal, we should be willing to take that first step. But how do we do this? Last week, we started our series and we talked about forgiveness and seeking reconciliation. But what do you do if you find yourself right in the middle of a conflict? You're in the middle of a fight with someone. If that is the case and you realize that you want to take steps towards peace, here are a few ideas I have for you for how you can start. All right, the first is this. Determine the level of your conflict. We'll explain that a little bit more here in a second. Because the word conflict is a bit vague. It could mean anything from a minor disagreement to a worldwide war, right? And if you take the time to learn a little bit more about the conflict you're experiencing, you might find it is a little bit easier to figure out how to take steps towards peace. So let's break down conflict into 4 different levels. You can write this down if you want. If not, just watch the screen. But if you have a conflict in mind that you are going through, as we walk through these 4 levels, try to think of which one best describes the conflict that you are experiencing. Level 1, we just don't like each other. We just don't like each other. At some point, in your life, we will all interact, and you will all interact with someone that you just don't like, that we simply just don't get along with. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have a major conflict with them, but it's also not super peaceful when you're around them. This type of conflict usually isn't the end of the world, but if you're not careful, it can grow into something much worse, like prejudice, when you unfairly judge the person without ever attempting to have a peaceful relationship. Or maybe it's level 2. A minor offense has been committed. In this type of conflict, a person has actually done something against you. Not a major issue, but it's enough that your irritation is higher than it would be if you just didn't get along. But perhaps this person has done something that has caused you to feel left out. Or maybe they have a habit of cutting you off when you're talking and drawing attention to themselves when you're in a group. These offenses, they may be minor, but they don't feel minor to you. Interestingly, this type of minor offense, the other person might not even be aware that they're making you upset. Okay? Level 3, a major offense might have been committed. This is the level where things start to escalate. Okay? It goes well beyond not getting along, and there's little to no reason to think that the other person might not know what they've done or that you're upset. Maybe you find out that they're talking about you, spreading rumors about you behind your back. Maybe they're not even hiding it, and they're being mean to you and straight to your face. Or it's also possible that something that used to be a minor offense has just gone on too long. And the longer it happens, the more hurtful it is. Regardless of what the offense is, this level of conflict is pretty serious. Not only does it have the potential for some long-term negative consequences for everyone involved, but conflict like this has a tendency to become all-consuming and can spiral out of control very quickly. And then we come to level 4. I'm in danger. This is the level where conflict has escalated to the point where you genuinely fear for your safety or for the safety of others. Plain and simple, if you find yourself in this type of conflict, it's absolutely crucial that you talk with a trusted adult. And if you aren't sure who to talk to, I want you to know that you can always talk to me or you can talk to any adult in this room. We are here for you. And no matter what, we will do whatever we can to help you and make sure that you are safe. But once you've taken a few minutes to determine how serious your conflict is, the next step is to own your share of the conflict. This is where we have a problem. Because often conflict involves offenses by more than just one person. And when we're trying to figure out how to take steps towards peace, it's helpful that we are willing to explore the possibility that we have also contributed to the conflict in some other way. The problem is that we are great about jumping super quick to conclusions or to the response of, it's all their fault, I didn't do anything, not me, lives at my house a lot. But we need to truly examine our thoughts, our motives, and our behaviors. But self-reflection isn't always as easy as it sounds. We don't want to admit that sometimes we can be at fault. But Jesus said it this way one time when he was teaching a crowd. He said it this way in Matthew chapter 7. He says, why worry about the speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your eye? How can you think of saying to your friend, let me help you get rid of the speck in your eye when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite, he calls you. First, get rid of the log in your own eye, and then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. The truth is, it is easier to call out when someone else is doing something wrong, or that it's obvious that the fault is with someone else. But both Jesus and Paul are challenging us to choose to be better than that. And we do that by being willing to ask ourselves some tough questions. Did I do anything to contribute to this conflict? Have I done anything in retaliation that made this conflict worse? What have I said or done or thought that caused pain for the other person? Now again, I'll be the first to admit that this ain't easy. These aren't easy questions to answer, especially since we aren't exactly able to be objective about our own thoughts and actions. That's why I would encourage you to ask someone else to weigh in. But first, I would make sure that this person is someone who has your best interest at heart, not another friend who's taking sides, and someone you trust, and someone you know will tell you the truth, even if you don't want to hear it. You need someone who will tell you to your face when you are wrong. You need this. And after all this, if you realize that you are responsible even for the smallest piece, I want to challenge you to own it. Own it. It's not going to be easy, but step up. Own it. Don't try to ignore it or convince yourself that what the other person did was worse than what you did. That's not helpful to anyone. And it certainly doesn't move the conflict anywhere closer to a peaceful resolution. If you realize that you have said something or done something to someone to hurt them, apologize to them. Even if the other person doesn't want to forgive you at first, admitting fault and taking responsibility for your share of the conflict can be a meaningful step towards peace. And once you've owned it, be sure that you don't continue to repeat the same kind of behavior. If you said something hurtful, apologize and be mindful of your words in the future. If you did something that caused someone to feel judged or excluded, apologize and resolve to be more aware of how your actions affect others. Now, this isn't going to solve every conflict that we come in contact with, right? But if you're willing to take the steps to understand the conflict and own the parts that you are responsible for, more often than not, you will find yourself moving towards peace. And remember, peace